10:14 a.m., rural Oklahoma. The law office was too quiet. The kind of quiet that presses against your ears until every small sound feels magnified. A clock ticked on the wall behind the attorney, each second sharp and deliberate, as if counting down something I didn't yet understand. Pale sunlight slipped through the blinds, laying thin lines across the polished table where my gloved hands rested. The wood felt cold beneath my palms, colder than the late summer air outside. "You get nothing." The words were spoken without ceremony, without even the courtesy of eye contact. The attorney didn't look at me when he said them. His gaze remained fixed on the open file in front of him, thick and orderly, my life reduced to documents and signatures. For a moment, I wondered if my hearing had failed me. Nothing? The word echoed inside my chest, heavy and hollow. My fingers trembled slightly, not from age, but from the shock of how final those words sounded. A manila envelope slid across the table toward me, its edges crisp, its movement practiced. It made a soft scraping sound before stopping just inches from my hands. "These are the remaining documents," the attorney added, his voice measured. "You're free to review them." Free? I almost laughed at the irony. Free from what? From my own place in the family I built? To my right, Stephen Crow shifted in his chair. He said nothing. He didn't need to. His silence was confident, satisfied. He believed this meeting was the end. I straightened my back and folded my hands carefully, forcing myself to stay still. Years of endurance had taught me one lesson: reacting too quickly only hands power away. The clock kept ticking. Outside, a car passed, tires crunching over gravel. Life moved on without pause. I stared at the envelope, untouched, and one thought cut through the shock with sudden clarity. Why was I even called here? 10:26 a.m., rural Oklahoma. I rose from the chair slowly, feeling the stiffness in my joints protest, as if they too had heard the verdict. The attorney was already stacking papers, the scrape of folders against wood signaling that in his mind this meeting was finished. The room felt smaller now, the air heavier, pressing against my chest with every breath. I held the envelope in both hands, surprised by its weight, as though it carried more than paper inside. Outside, the courthouse steps were warm under my shoes, sun-soaked and familiar. The contrast unsettled me. The world looked the same as it had when I walked in, yet something essential had shifted. A faint breeze stirred the dust near the railing, brushing against my face. I paused, closing my eyes for just a moment. "Do not let them see you bend," I told myself. "Not here." Stephen Crow passed beside me, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the stone. His cologne lingered in the air, clean, expensive, deliberate. He didn't look at me. That absence of acknowledgement stung more than any insult. To him, I was already erased. I watched him descend the steps and cross the street, his shoulders relaxed, his stride unhurried. Gravel snapped beneath his tires as his car pulled away, carrying his certainty with it. I sat on a bench beneath a thin maple tree, its leaves whispering softly overhead. The envelope rested on my lap, pale and unassuming. I traced its edge with my thumb, grounding myself in the texture. Shame crept in first, then fear, quick and sharp. But beneath them, something steadier took hold. Clarity. Around me the town moved on, doors opening, voices passing, life continuing without pause. I realized then they believed I was finished. As I stood and walked toward my car, I kept my gaze forward, one quiet thought repeating with calm resolve. They have no idea who they just underestimated. 7:02 p.m., my kitchen table, Oklahoma. That night, I placed the envelope beside a chipped ceramic mug and let the silence speak. It carried me backward, 25 years at least, to a younger woman who believed love was proven through consistency. I married young, worked hard, and learned early that survival meant endurance. We built a life slowly, a modest house, a vegetable garden, accounts opened with careful signatures. I kept records because no one else wanted to. I paid bills, filed papers, remembered dates, and never complained when gratitude went unspoken. After my husband passed, responsibility settled fully on my shoulders. I raised children who grew busy, then distant. I filled the quiet with purpose. I saved where I could, clipped coupons, skipped comforts, and set aside money not for myself, but for stability. I believed legacy meant protection, not praise. When relatives asked for help, I gave it. When advice was requested, I offered it gently, then stepped back. I was dependable, predictable, and easy to overlook. Stephen Crow entered our world during those years, sharp-eyed, smooth-voiced. He spoke the language of efficiency and assured everyone he knew how to handle the complicated parts. I noticed how conversations changed when he spoke, how decisions suddenly felt rushed. Still, I trusted the process because I trusted family. That trust was my greatest weakness and my deepest strength. I opened old drawers that evening, spreading documents across the table, deeds, statements, notes in my own handwriting. I had kept them instinctively, quietly, without applause. As I sorted them, memory after memory rose, each sacrifice lining up like witnesses. The past was no longer distant. It was present, undeniable, and ready to speak. I sat there breathing slowly, realizing patience had been my armor long before I understood it. 7:18 p.m., same kitchen. Stephen Crow did not arrive like a villain. He arrived like a solution. He spoke calmly, dressed neatly, and always carried a leather folder tucked under his arm. When he was introduced to the family, he shook my hand firmly and smiled as if respect came naturally to him. "I'll make sure everything is handled properly," he said, and people relaxed the moment those words left his mouth. At first I appreciated his confidence. He explained legal matters quickly, using terms that sounded reassuring, but discouraged questions. When I asked for clarification, he laughed softly and said, "It's just procedural, Hazel. Nothing you need to worry about." Each time, I felt a small tightening in my chest, a quiet signal I chose to ignore. I had spent my life trusting systems, trusting family, trusting that good intentions were enough. The red flags were subtle, meetings scheduled without me, Papers summarized instead of shown, decisions framed as urgent, leaving no room for reflection. Stephen never raised his voice. He didn't need to. Control, I learned, can be exercised politely. I noticed how he positioned himself, always closer to the head of the table, always speaking first. Slowly, my role shifted from contributor to observer. One evening, after everyone left, I gathered the courage to ask why certain documents no longer carried my name. Stephen's smile never faded. "It simplifies things," he said evenly. "You've done enough already." The words sounded kind, but they landed heavy. Enough, as if my usefulness had expired. That night, alone, I stacked my papers and slid them back into their drawer. I told myself I was being cautious, not suspicious. Still, as I turned off the kitchen light, a thought lingered in the dark. People who rush you want what's best. 8:03 p.m., winter evening, Oklahoma. The first betrayal did not feel like betrayal at all. It arrived wrapped in reassurance, spoken gently across my own dining table. Stephen Crow spread documents neatly in front of me, aligning the corners as if precision itself proved honesty. The heater hummed softly, and outside, wind tapped against the windows. "This is just to streamline things," he said, sliding a pen toward my hand. "Temporary, purely administrative." I remember holding that pen longer than necessary. It felt heavier than it should have, cool against my fingers. I asked what would change. Stephen smiled, patient, almost indulgent. "Nothing important," he replied. "Your intentions stay the same. This just makes the process smoother." Around him, family members nodded, eager to be done, eager to trust someone who sounded so certain. I looked at their faces and felt the familiar pull to keep the peace. If everyone else feels safe, I thought, maybe I'm being difficult. So, I signed. The pen scratched across the paper louder than I expected, each stroke sounding final. Stephen collected the pages immediately, stacking them with practiced speed. "I'll take care of filing," he said. "You don't need to worry about a thing." The words were comforting, but something inside me recoiled. Responsibility had always been mine. Surrendering it felt unnatural. Days later, I asked for copies. Stephen waved the question away. "Already handled," he said. "You'll get everything when it's finalized." His tone was light, but firm enough to end the conversation. That was when the unease settled in fully, quiet, persistent. That night I lay awake listening to the house settle, replaying the moment my name left the page. Why did it feel like I'd given something away I couldn't reclaim? The answer stayed just out of reach. But the damage was done. The first line had been crossed, softly, politely, and without resistance. 9:11 p.m., early spring, Oklahoma. The second betrayal unfolded slowly, like something meant to go unnoticed. It began with silence. Phone calls went unanswered. Messages were returned days later, short, carefully worded. When I asked for updates, Stephen Crow assured me everything was on track. His voice was calm, almost bored, as if my concern itself was unnecessary. Weeks passed, then months. Decisions were made without my presence. Meetings happened last minute, always after they were already finished. I learned details through fragments, half sentences at family dinners, conversations that stopped when I entered the room. Each time I felt the ground shift slightly beneath me, subtle enough to doubt myself. Maybe I forgot, I thought. Maybe I misunderstood. One afternoon I received a summary instead of the documents I had requested. Stephen handed it to me with a polite smile. "This covers everything," he said. I scanned the page, my heart tightening with each line, numbers without context, outcomes without explanation. My questions were met with gentle deflection. "Trust me," he repeated, "it's complicated." Late at night, I began checking my old records, spreading papers across the table just as I had years before. Something didn't align. Dates were missing. Transfers appeared without clear authorization. When I asked again, this time firmly, Stephen's tone changed. "You're worrying too much," he said. "At your age, stress isn't good for you." The words stung, not because they were loud, but because they were dismissive. In that moment, I understood the strategy. Confusion weakens resistance. Distance creates control. As I gathered my papers, a quiet resolve formed. If they wanted me uninformed, I realized, it was because the truth would not favor them. 10:42 p.m., late spring, Oklahoma. The third betrayal did not arrive quietly. It announced itself in a single sentence, spoken with practiced calm. We were seated around the table, papers spread between us, when I pointed to a missing line and asked, plainly, why my name no longer appeared. Stephen Crow leaned back slightly, folded his hands, and sighed, as though I were a child asking the same question twice. "You wouldn't understand," he said. The room went still. I felt heat rise behind my eyes, sharp and unexpected. That sentence carried more weight than any document he had hidden. It dismissed my intelligence, my history, my right to question what I had helped build. "You wouldn't understand," as if understanding belonged only to those who took, never to those who protected. I asked him to explain anyway. Stephen smiled, thin, controlled. "It's handled," he replied. "There's no need to complicate things now." Someone cleared their throat. No one met my eyes. In that silence, I realized I had already been erased from the conversation, rewritten as an inconvenience rather than a contributor. I gathered my papers slowly, each movement deliberate. My hands were steady, but inside something cracked open. It wasn't anger yet. It was clarity. Every ignored question, every rushed signature, every withheld page aligned into a single truth. This was never about efficiency. It was about removal. Later, alone, I stood in my kitchen holding the same pen I had used months before. I set it down carefully, as if placing it back into my past. They think I'm finished, I thought. The realization did not weaken me. It hardened into resolve, because the moment they stopped explaining was the moment I stopped trusting and began preparing. 6:55 a.m., early morning, Oklahoma. The house was quiet, in the way only early morning can be, before the world remembers itself. I stood alone in the kitchen, watching steam rise from my coffee as pale light crept through the window. Birds called softly outside, unaware of the shift that had taken place inside me. The confrontation from the night before replayed in my mind, not loudly, but with sharp clarity. I did not cry. That surprised me. Instead, I felt something steadier settle into my chest. Acceptance, not of defeat, but of reality. I had been removed deliberately, piece by piece, and now I could finally see the shape of it. Seeing clearly, I thought, is its own kind of relief. I opened drawers I hadn't touched in years. Inside were envelopes, folders, notes written in my careful handwriting. Copies of documents I'd been told were unnecessary to keep, receipts from accounts long forgotten by everyone but me. I laid them out on the table, one by one, like placing stones across a river. Each paper represented a moment of caution I once questioned. Now they felt purposeful. There was no rush in my movements. I worked slowly, deliberately, listening to the house creak as it warmed. This was not revenge forming. It was preparation. I made a simple list on a yellow notepad, dates, names, questions that had never been answered. The act itself was grounding. For the first time since Stephen Crow entered our lives, I felt ahead of him, not louder, not stronger, just ready. As the sun rose higher, I stacked the papers neatly and slid them into a single envelope. I set it aside, unopened, and whispered to myself with quiet certainty, "They believe I am finished. I have not even begun." 2:18 p.m., downtown Oklahoma City. The office I entered that afternoon was smaller, quieter, and far less polished than Stephen Crow's world. The carpet was worn, the furniture mismatched, but the air felt honest. I sat across from a different kind of attorney, one who listened without interrupting, who let silence exist without rushing to fill it. Sunlight pooled softly on the desk between us as I placed my envelope down with care. "I don't need drama," I said evenly. "I need clarity." He nodded once. "Then let's start at the beginning." So, I did. I spoke slowly, recounting years of decisions, signatures, omissions. I slid documents across the desk as I talked, copies I had kept instinctively, records no one else remembered. As he reviewed them, his expression shifted, not to shock, but to recognition. He asked precise questions. He wrote notes. When I finished, the room felt different, heavier with possibility. "These protections," he said finally, tapping one page, "they were set up years ago, very carefully." He looked at me then, really looked at me. "You understood more than they realized." I felt something loosen in my chest, not triumph, validation. We discussed next steps quietly, no raised voices, no promises of revenge, just process, procedure, the law used as it was meant to be. When I stood to leave, my posture felt straighter, my breath deeper. I had not revealed everything, only what was necessary. Outside, traffic hummed, and the city moved with practiced indifference. I held my envelope close, aware now of its true weight. Stephen Crow believed the story was over. He believed silence meant surrender. As I walked toward my car, a calm thought followed me like a shadow. Preparation is invisible until it isn't. 5:41 p.m., late afternoon, Oklahoma. The days that followed moved with deceptive calm. On the surface, nothing changed. Stephen Crow continued as if the matter were settled, his confidence untouched, his tone relaxed whenever our paths crossed. He spoke of future plans as though they were already written in ink. I listened politely, nodded when expected, and said very little. Silence, I had learned, was now my advantage. Behind that silence, things were shifting. Papers were filed quietly. Timelines were established. I answered questions carefully, never more than necessary. Each step felt like placing weight onto a scale that had long been uneven. I could feel the balance beginning to correct itself, though no one else could see it yet. Let them believe what they want, I reminded myself. Belief is not the same as truth. One afternoon, a notice arrived in the mail, unremarkable in appearance. I held it for a long moment before opening it, recognizing the language immediately. Formal, neutral, unemotional. The kind of words that carry consequences without announcing them. I read it once, then again. My pulse steady. A date had been set. A door had been opened. That evening, I placed the notice back into the envelope and sealed it carefully. The act felt ceremonial, deliberate. Across town, I knew Stephen was unaware, still convinced of his control. That knowledge did not bring satisfaction. It brought focus. As night settled in, I turned off the lights and stood briefly in the dark, listening to the house breathe around me. Everything was in motion now, even if it appeared still. The path ahead was no longer uncertain. It was simply waiting. And somewhere, without realizing it, Stephen Crow was approaching the moment he could no longer step away from. 9:08 a.m., County Courthouse, Oklahoma. The courtroom was brighter than I expected, sunlight reflecting off pale walls and polished floors. I took my seat quietly, smoothing my coat, feeling the steady rhythm of my own breathing. Across the room, Stephen Crow stood with relaxed confidence, greeting people as though this were a formality, not a reckoning. He did not look in my direction. He did not need to. At least he thought he didn't. When proceedings began, voices were calm, almost conversational. Documents were referenced. Dates were confirmed. Then my attorney spoke. He rose without urgency and placed a single folder on the table. The sound it made was soft, but it cut through the room with precision. Inside were trusts, safeguards, and accounts established years earlier, structures designed not for wealth, but for protection. Structures Stephen had never bothered to look for. I watched as his posture changed, subtle at first, a pause too long, a question repeated. His certainty wavered as the narrative he had relied on began to fracture. The judge leaned forward. Clarifications were requested. Explanations were required. Stephen's voice tightened, no longer smooth, no longer assured. I said very little. I didn't need to. The truth spoke clearly, line by line, signature by signature. What had been hidden in plain sight was now visible to everyone. The room shifted, not dramatically, but unmistakably. Authority changed hands. For the first time, Stephen looked at me, really looked. Not with dismissal, but with disbelief. I met his gaze calmly, without triumph, without anger. This is what preparation looks like, I thought. As the judge called for a brief recess, I folded my hands and waited. The reveal was complete, but the consequences were just beginning. 11:36 a.m., County Courthouse Hallway, Oklahoma. The recess ended, and we were called back into the courtroom. The air felt tighter now, charged in a way it hadn't been before. I could hear the soft shuffle of shoes, the creak of benches, the quiet clearing of throats. When everyone was seated, the judge spoke with calm authority, inviting final statements and clarifications. This time, the room listened differently. Stephen Crow stood again, adjusting his jacket too carefully. He spoke longer than necessary, his words circling themselves, attempting to regain control. Each sentence sounded rehearsed, defensive. The confidence he once carried so easily now strained under the weight of scrutiny. I watched his hands as he spoke. They no longer rested still. They moved, betraying tension. Then my attorney rose. His voice was measured, respectful, precise. He laid out the facts plainly, connecting years of preparation to the present moment. Each document was referenced clearly, each safeguard explained without embellishment. There was no drama in his delivery, only truth. I felt a quiet steadiness inside me, the kind that comes from standing on solid ground. When I was asked to speak, I stood slowly. The room fell silent. I did not come here to punish, I said. I came to be acknowledged. My voice did not shake. Everything presented today was created to protect what mattered, long before anyone thought to take it. Eyes turned toward Stephen. Whispers followed. The shift was unmistakable. In that moment, the story he had told about me collapsed publicly, replaced by one he could not control. I sat back down, hands folded, as the judge nodded thoughtfully. Justice did not announce itself loudly. It settled into the room, undeniable and irreversible. 1:04 p.m., County Courthouse steps, Oklahoma. The ruling came without spectacle. No raised voices, no dramatic pause, just measured words delivered with finality. As the judge concluded, I felt the weight of years lift, not suddenly, but steadily, like pressure easing from a wound that had long been ignored. Around me, chairs shifted. Conversations began in hushed tones. Stephen Crow remained standing, frozen in a way that felt unfamiliar to him. Outside, the courthouse steps filled with quiet movement. I stood to one side as people passed, their expressions altered, curious. Stephen emerged moments later, his face pale, his posture diminished. The man who once controlled every room now avoided eye contact. Whispers followed him, not cruel, but consequential. Reputation, I realized, doesn't collapse loudly. It erodes in public. He did not approach me. He did not apologize. Instead, he walked away quickly, shoulders tight, phone already pressed to his ear. I knew those calls would not go the way he hoped. Trust, once questioned, rarely returns intact. His authority had been built on assumption, and assumption had failed him. I remained where I was, breathing in the warm afternoon air. Justice had done its work without requiring me to raise my voice or defend my worth. Others now asked the questions I once had, and Stephen would have to answer them again and again. That was consequence enough. As I descended the steps, sunlight hit my face fully. I felt no triumph, only certainty. The story others told about me had changed, and with it, the balance of power. What had been taken quietly was returned publicly. And Stephen Crow would never again mistake silence for weakness. 3:22 p.m., quiet neighborhood, Oklahoma. I returned home alone, the familiar creak of the front door greeting me like an old friend. Inside, the house felt unchanged, yet lighter, as if it too had been holding its breath. I set my purse down slowly and stood in the entryway, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant bark of a dog. Ordinary sounds, grounding, kind. I made tea and sat at the kitchen table where so many decisions had been made in silence. My hands rested flat against the wood, steady. For the first time in months, my thoughts did not race ahead or circle backward. They stayed with me. I allowed myself to feel the ache of what was lost, not just money or trust, but years of being unseen. Healing, I realized, begins with honesty. I did not feel victorious. I felt complete. Justice had not restored my youth or erased mistakes, but it returned something far more important, my voice. I spoke aloud, softly, just to hear it fill the room. You were never foolish, I told myself. You were careful. The words settled gently, like dust after a storm. That evening I placed the envelope into a drawer and closed it without ceremony. Its purpose had been fulfilled. As dusk colored the windows, I sat quietly, breathing evenly, letting peace arrive without question. What remained was not anger, but gratitude for resilience, for patience, for the strength that grows when silence finally ends. I understood then that healing is not forgetting, but remembering without pain, carrying lessons forward, choosing dignity daily. Tomorrow would come quietly, and I would meet it unchanged, yet renewed, certain that my life and my name belonged fully to me again. At last the silence felt earned and peaceful. 6:48 a.m., sunrise, Oklahoma. Morning arrived gently, pale light spilling across the fields beyond my window. I stood there longer than usual, watching the day begin without urgency. The world did not rush me, and for the first time in a long while, I did not feel the need to rush myself. Everything that mattered had already been decided. I opened the drawer one last time and took out the envelope. It was worn now, its edges softened from use, no longer sharp, no longer intimidating. I held it briefly, feeling its thinness, remembering how heavy it once seemed. Objects only carry power, I thought, when we give it to them. I placed it back where it belonged and closed the drawer with quiet finality. What I learned was simple, though it took a lifetime to understand. Silence is not absence. Patience is not weakness. And preparation, when done with care, speaks louder than outrage ever could. I had lived most of my life unnoticed, and that anonymity had protected me more than applause ever would have. Stephen Crow believed control came from speed and confidence. I learned that true strength comes from waiting, watching, and knowing when to stand. Justice did not arrive with celebration. It arrived with balance, with truth, with my name restored to the story it had always belonged to. As the sun rose higher, I made myself breakfast and sat at the table, content in the ordinary rhythm of my life. There was nothing left to prove. If someone listening to my story carries one thing forward, let it be this: never underestimate those who move quietly. Some of us are not silent because we are afraid. Some of us are silent because we are prepared.